Black Maid saves a child's life, but then realizes who her real father is. The mansion glowed with polished marble floors, chandeliers that shimmered even in the daytime, and long hallways lined with expensive paintings. It was a world that breathed wealth and power. But in its corners and along its edges moved the woman who kept it alive without ever being seen. She was the maid, a black woman in her 30s, dressed in her crisp uniform and sensible shoes, carrying a quiet strength that most overlooked. Her hands were roughened by years of scrubbing floors and polishing silver, but they moved with practiced grace, every task done with care. She began her mornings before the rest of the household stirred. The clatter of dishes in the kitchen was hers. The smell of bread baking early often her doing, though no one credited her when the family praised the chef. She laid out the dining table with perfect precision, every glass sparkling, every fork aligned, as if a single mistake would betray her worth. When the children ran through the hallways, leaving trails of toys and smudges on the walls, she followed silently, restoring order without being asked. Though she was rarely thanked, she knew she was invisible to most of them. Guests brushed past her as if she were part of the wallpaper. Relatives sometimes spoke about her while she stood within earshot, lowering their voices only slightly, calling her the help as if she had no name. Even the family she worked for, though never openly cruel, often acted as though her presence was a background noise, something expected but not acknowledged. She smiled politely when spoken to, bowed her head when dismissed, and carried on with her duties as if the lack of recognition did not sting. Yet beneath the silence, she carried herself with dignity. Her uniform was always neat, her hair pinned carefully away from her face, her shoes polished though they were worn thin from use. When she walked through the grand hallways, her steps were steady, her back straight. She did not allow herself to slouch under the weight of their disregard. Inside, she held a quiet belief that her work mattered even if no one admitted it. She took pride in the way the rooms gleamed, in the way the linen smelled fresh, in the way the home looked flawless when guests arrived. She told herself that dignity did not come from their acknowledgement, but from her own standards. There were moments when her kindness broke through the walls around her. The children, too young to understand social lines, sometimes clung to her leg when frightened or called for her when they were sick in the night. She stayed by their sides until they slept, her touch gentle, her voice soft. The gardener once hurt his hand trimming the roses, and it was she who wrapped the wound quickly, offering him a smile that reminded him he was not alone. Her compassion lingered in places the family did not see, in the ways she lifted others quietly, while never asking for thanks. Though she felt underestimated and overlooked, she never allowed bitterness to harden her spirit. Each day, she tied her apron strings a little tighter and stepped into her work with the same resolve. To her, strength was not loud. It was the quiet endurance of being dismissed, yet refusing to lose pride in who she was. She knew the mansion did not notice her presence, but without her, it would not shine as it did. And even if she was only ever called the maid, she knew within herself she was much more. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of the mansion, scattering golden light across the marble floors. She moved with her usual quiet rhythm, polishing the banisters, dusting the corners where no one else ever thought to look, making the home gleam as if it had been untouched by time. Her focus was steady, her mind occupied only with the order she imposed on the endless rooms. The family was out of sight, the house unusually still, and she welcomed the calm. It was in these moments that her work felt almost meditative, the sound of her cloth against polished wood, the only music she needed. As she stepped out onto the terrace to shake out a cloth, the sound of laughter caught her attention. It was high and innocent, the laughter of a child. Her eyes darted across the sprawling estate, and her breath caught when she saw the billionaire's youngest son toddling near the edge of the swimming pool. No adult was near him, no nanny watching from the shadows. He leaned forward on unsteady legs, his small hands reaching for a toy that had rolled too close to the water's surface. The ripples shimmered beneath him, a silent threat. Her heart surged into her throat. She dropped the cloth without thinking and sprinted forward, her shoes skidding against the polished stone. Her voice called out, sharp but urgent, warning the boy to stop. But he was too young to understand, too focused on retrieving the toy that glimmered in the sunlight. His tiny feet slipped on the wet edge, and his body tilted forward, the laughter turning into a startled cry. In that instant, she did not think of herself, of the risk, or of how the family might scold her later for running across the terrace. She lunged, her arms outstretched, just as his body tipped into the pool. Cold water splashed up, soaking her uniform as her fingers closed around his arm. She pulled with all the strength her years of labor had given her, hauling him back onto the terrace with a gasp. His small chest heaved with sobs, his face pressed into her shoulder as she clutched him tight. For a moment she stayed kneeling there, her heart pounding as though it would break free from her chest. She rocked the child gently, whispering words of comfort, brushing back his damp hair as his crying softened into hiccups. Her uniform clung to her skin, heavy with water, but she did not let go until his breathing steadied. Only then did she notice the sound of footsteps pounding toward them. A pair of relatives who had been entertaining themselves inside burst onto the terrace, their eyes widening at the sight of the maid holding the boy. Their shock was palpable, but she paid them no attention. She looked only at the child, still trembling in her arms, safe because she had acted without hesitation. In those frantic moments, she had not been invisible, not a shadow in the background. She had been the only one who noticed, the only one who moved, the one who had saved a life before disaster claimed it. She stood slowly, still holding the boy close, her breath steady now, her dignity intact even as water dripped from her sleeves onto the pristine terrace floor. She had risked everything without thinking, and though she knew she might return to being unseen tomorrow, in this moment she had been exactly who the child needed most. The cries of the child carried through the vast halls, piercing the calm that had blanketed the estate only minutes before. The maid stood on the terrace, her uniform soaked, her arms wrapped firmly around the boy who had nearly slipped into the pool. His small face was buried in her shoulder, his sobs muffled but insistent, his fingers gripping the fabric of her sleeve as if letting go would mean danger would return. She whispered softly into his ear, words of comfort more instinct than thought, her hand moving in slow circles against his trembling back. The first to arrive was the boy's mother. She rushed through the glass doors with panic etched across her face, her jewelry clinking against her wrist as she reached out for her son. Her eyes widened at the sight of the maid holding him so protectively, both of them dripping with water. For a heartbeat she froze, torn between gratitude and disbelief. Her breath caught as she realized what had nearly happened. Then her voice rose, sharp and frantic, demanding to know how her child had been left alone, how danger had come so close under so many watchful eyes. Behind her trailed a crowd of staff and a few well-dressed guests who had been lingering in the drawing room. Their conversations stopped abruptly as they saw the scene unfold. Some gasped, covering their mouths with gloved hands. Others whispered, their voices low but urgent, the shock traveling quickly among them. The sight of the maid at the center of it all unsettled them. She had been background, someone whose presence was acknowledged only when something needed cleaning or serving. Now she stood as the figure who had acted when no one else had, the child clinging to her with desperate trust. The guests reacted with unease, some insisting aloud that it must have been luck, that she had simply been in the right place at the right time. One older man muttered that anyone could have done the same, brushing the gravity of her act aside. But the staff knew better. They had seen her move, seen the urgency with which she had thrown herself forward, the way she had not hesitated when others would have faltered. They exchanged glances that carried a new kind of respect, though none spoke it aloud. The mother reached for her son, but he tightened his grip around the maid's neck, refusing to release her. His sobs grew louder when she tried to separate them. His face pressed harder into the shoulder that had held him since the moment he was pulled from the water. The room quieted at the sight, the weight of it settling over everyone present. The child's choice spoke louder than words, his small arms declaring where he felt safest. The maid finally looked up, her eyes calm but steady. She said nothing, her silence carrying more power than any explanation. The boy's mother faltered, her expression softening as she realized that her son, who so often ran from one set of arms to another without care, had chosen to stay where he felt truly protected. The air in the house shifted. For the first time, the maid was not invisible. She was no longer just the figure who moved through rooms unnoticed. She was the woman who had acted when others did not, whose bravery had saved a child. Some would still dismiss it as chance, unwilling to admit they had misjudged her. But others began to see what had always been there, the strength and dignity she carried in silence. And in that moment, with a child refusing to let go, she stood at the center of a household, forced to face the truth of her worth. The evening sun slanted through the tall windows, casting golden streaks across the floor when the billionaire finally returned. He entered the mansion with his usual commanding stride, his presence filling the great hall before his voice even carried. The guests moved aside, lowering their heads in deference, and the staff straightened their posture at once. He was used to such reverence, used to being the center of gravity in every room he walked into. But this time, when his eyes fell on the scene before him, something shifted. His young son clung tightly to the maid's arms, his small face still red from tears, his body refusing to release the woman who had pulled him from danger. The mother rushed to explain, her words tumbling over one another in frantic detail, recounting how the maid had seen the boy near the pool and leapt without hesitation, how she had dragged him to safety even at risk to herself. The guests added their voices, eager to be part of the story, their tones filled with awe, though some still laced their remarks with disbelief. The staff looked on silently, their eyes betraying a quiet respect that had not been there before. The billionaire's gaze lingered on the maid. She stood a little apart from the crowd, her uniform clinging damply to her frame, her hair falling loose around her face from the chaos of the afternoon. She did not speak, did not draw attention to herself, but her calm composure in the aftermath struck him more than the frantic voices around him. He stepped forward, his towering figure casting a shadow across the marble floor, and for the first time he addressed her, not as a servant but as someone worthy of acknowledgement. "You saved my son's life," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. There was no grandeur in his tone, no inflated rhetoric, only a weight of sincerity rarely heard from him. "For that you have my gratitude." A hush fell. It was rare to hear such words from him, rare for the staff to see him break from the cool authority that defined his presence. The boy tightened his arms around her neck at the sound of his father's voice, refusing still to be passed into anyone else's care. The billionaire's eyes softened at the sight, but as he stepped closer, something else caught his attention. Around her neck, barely visible beneath the damp collar of her uniform, glimmered a small locket. The chain was delicate, silver dulled with age, the locket itself oval and worn from years of touch. As she shifted, trying to calm the child against her shoulder, the locket slipped free, swinging gently in the air. His eyes locked onto it, a flicker of recognition passing across his features. For a moment, his composure faltered. He had seen that locket before, or one almost identical. It stirred something deep in his memory, something he had long buried. His jaw tightened slightly as his gaze lingered. Questions rose, unbidden, pressing against his thoughts. Who had given it to her? Why did it look so achingly familiar? He looked at her again, not as the maid who had blended into the background for years, but as a woman carrying a detail of a past that brushed against his own. His gratitude remained, but now it was accompanied by unease, by the unmistakable sense that her story held pieces he had never considered. The voices around him faded into a dull hum as his mind wrestled with the image of the locket, the boy's arms wrapped firmly around her, and the quiet strength in her eyes. He thanked her again, his tone steadier, but behind his words lingered a question he could not yet form aloud. The locket had sparked something he could not ignore, and though he said nothing more, his gaze told her and everyone else that this moment had opened a door to secrets long hidden. The days after the rescue carried a new kind of tension in the mansion. Outwardly, life continued as before, with guests coming and going, the staff moving quietly through the halls, and the routines of wealth pressing forward without pause. Yet beneath the surface, something unsettled lingered. The billionaire had been different since that afternoon. His words of gratitude had surprised everyone, but it was the way his eyes had locked on the locket around her neck that remained in the air. She noticed it too. Each time he passed her, his gaze lingered a moment too long, not unkind but searching, as if he were trying to fit together pieces of a puzzle that no one else could see. One evening, while the household prepared for a gathering, she was summoned to his study. It was rare for him to request her presence directly. She entered nervously, her apron smoothed, her hands folded in front of her. He sat behind a massive oak desk, a stack of old documents spread out before him. He did not look at her immediately, only tapped his finger on a folded envelope that bore the marks of time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its commanding tone. "I saw your locket," he said. "Where did you get it?" Her hand instinctively rose to touch the chain at her throat. She hesitated, unsure if speaking honestly would cost her the place she had worked so hard to hold. But something in his expression urged her forward. She told him it had been her mother's, passed down to her as the only thing of value she carried from her childhood. She explained that her mother had spoken little of the past, but the locket had always been described as belonging to someone important, someone she would never meet. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his face pale beneath the warm glow of the desk lamp. He reached for one of the envelopes, sliding it toward her with unsteady fingers. Inside were letters, written decades ago. The ink faded, but the words still sharp. She scanned them slowly, her eyes catching on familiar details. The name of her mother, references to a romance hidden from the world, and the promise of a child the writer never knew had come into being. Her breath caught as realization sank in. He was the writer. The man who sat before her, the one she had served in silence for years, was the man her mother had loved in secret. He had never been told of the pregnancy, never knew that the child had been born. Shock rippled through her as she looked at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the distance she had always felt from him with the blood that now tied them together. His voice broke the silence, rough with disbelief. He admitted that he had been young and reckless, that his relationship with her mother had been cut short by circumstance and pride. He confessed that he had moved on, building his empire, never knowing he had left behind a daughter who would one day stand in his home as a servant. His eyes, usually hard, now glistened with regret. She clutched the locket at her chest, her body trembling. All the years of invisibility, the quiet endurance of being dismissed as nothing more than help, now collided with the truth that she was blood of the same line that owned everything around her. Her heart ached with confusion, with grief for the years stolen, but also with the faintest spark of vindication. She was not simply the maid. She had never been. She was his daughter, hidden in plain sight, and the truth had finally surfaced. The revelation did not stay contained within the walls of the study. Secrets had a way of seeping out, carried in the tones of hushed voices and the glances exchanged among those who had always believed themselves to know the order of the house. By the next morning, the entire household seemed to hum with unease. The staff moved through the halls with lowered eyes, their whispers following her wherever she walked. Some looked at her with pity, others with disbelief, but all of them understood now that she was not who they had always assumed her to be. The billionaire carried himself differently as well. His usual confidence, the air of command that made every room bend to him, had faltered. He spoke less, his words weighed down by guilt, his face drawn as though the weight of decades pressed on him all at once. He kept his distance from her in public, but she felt his presence everywhere, felt his eyes linger when he thought she would not notice. It was as if he was trapped between wanting to acknowledge her and fearing what acknowledgement might destroy. For her, the truth was a storm. She went about her duties with the same precision, scrubbing floors, folding linens, polishing silver, but inside she was raw and unsettled. Every corner of the mansion that she had once accepted as belonging to others now pressed against her with a cruel irony. She had been serving in silence, invisible in her father's house. never knowing that the blood of its master ran in her veins. She thought of her mother, and the years she had spent raising her alone, of the silence that must have hidden heartbreak, and her chest ached with the pain of an abandonment that was not chosen, but had marked her life nonetheless. The whispers of the staff only deepened the wound. Some muttered that she must be fabricating the connection. Others insisted the documents proved everything, and still others speculated on what it meant for the future of the household. Every word stung. She had never sought this truth, had never wanted to be anything other than honest in her work, and now she bore the weight of a secret she had not asked to uncover. Through the turmoil, it was the child who had clung to her after the rescue who anchored her. He followed her with a loyalty that seemed instinctive, his small hand reaching for hers in the hallways, his laughter bubbling whenever she appeared. At night, when he cried for comfort, it was her name he called, not the nurse's or even his own mother. In his innocent gaze, she was not a scandal or a secret, but simply the person who had saved him, the arms he trusted most. She would kneel beside his bed, smoothing his hair back as he drifted into sleep, and in those quiet moments, the noise of the household faded. The whispers, the guilt, the judgment all disappeared, replaced by the soft rhythm of a child's breathing and the warmth of his small hand curled around her fingers. It reminded her that love, in its truest form, asked for nothing but presence. The billionaire passed by one evening as she soothed his son. He paused at the doorway, his expression shadowed with guilt and longing. He said nothing, but his eyes spoke of a man crushed by the knowledge of what he had missed, of what he had unknowingly denied both her and himself. She did not look up at him, her focus solely on the boy, but in that silence he understood that her strength was not something he could claim or explain away. She had built it herself, through years of quiet endurance, through the love she gave freely even when none was returned. The house remained unsettled, but within her heart a new truth began to form. She had been abandoned unknowingly, dismissed unfairly, and whispered about cruelly. Yet she was more than all of it. In the bond she shared with the child she had saved, she found a reflection of the love she had always deserved, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe she was worthy of it. The tension that had settled over the household could not last forever. Whispers had turned into questions, questions into speculation, and speculation into silence too heavy to ignore. The billionaire could no longer retreat behind closed doors, no longer hide from the truth that had unraveled before him. His staff moved with uncertainty. His wife avoided his gaze, and his son clung to the woman who had once been invisible to them all. It became clear that a reckoning had to come, and when it did, it was in the grand hall where the family often gathered to host their most important guests. The room was filled that evening with the glow of chandeliers, though the mood was far from celebratory. The staff had been summoned, standing along the walls with expressions of unease. A handful of relatives were present as well, their faces tight with curiosity and judgment. At the center of it all stood the maid, her uniform pressed as always, her chin lifted, though her heart pounded beneath her chest. She had not asked for any of this, but she understood that her life could no longer continue in quiet anonymity. The billionaire stepped forward, his figure commanding, though tonight his shoulders carried the weight of years lost. His voice, when it came, was uncharacteristically raw. He admitted what had been discovered, the letters, the locket, the truth that could no longer be denied. He spoke of her mother, of the past he had buried without knowing what it truly meant, and his words faltered as he confessed his guilt. For the first time, he did not speak as a man in control, but as a man humbled by what he had unknowingly abandoned. Then he turned to her, the woman who had worked in his house for years without recognition. His eyes, usually hard with authority, softened with something close to reverence. He said her name aloud, not followed by the word maid, not marked by command, but with the tenderness of someone speaking to family. He declared before everyone that she was his daughter, not a servant, not an employee. His child, blood of his blood, no longer hidden in plain sight. The hall was silent, the weight of the announcement pressing into every corner. The staff exchanged startled glances. The relatives shifted uneasily, but no one spoke. The boy broke the silence. From where he stood near her, small hands clinging to her skirt, he looked up with bright, trusting eyes. In a voice unshaken by the politics of adults, he called her Auntie. The word rang through the hall like a bell, pure and undeniable. It was not rehearsed, not forced, but born of the love he felt for the woman who had saved him and comforted him when no one else had. She bent down, her eyes stinging with tears she had not meant to shed, and gathered him into her arms. The title, spoken so innocently, sealed what words of acknowledgement could only begin. She belonged, not as someone who served silently in the shadows, but as family whose worth could no longer be denied. Applause began softly, hesitant from the edges of the room, then grew as courage spread among those who had witnessed everything. The staff who had once whispered now clapped openly, some even smiling with pride. The relatives, reluctant though they were, bowed their heads in acceptance. In that moment, she was honored not only for her courage in saving the boy, but for the quiet strength she had carried for years when no one had seen her. The billionaire stood beside her, no longer distant, his guilt tempered by the resolve to make right what time had stolen. The boy nestled against her, whispering Auntie again, as though it were the most natural word in the world. And for the first time, she felt the dignity and love she had been denied for so long. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the maid. She was family.